bigger crisis that is threatening us, which is that of environmental catastrophe. So I'd like it if we spent a few minutes introducing ourselves, so we know everyone on the call, and then we'll go into a deeper discussion about the lives and actions of these wonderful guests. Jane, would you have a few minutes to introduce yourself to people who are listening all over Britain, perhaps all over the world tonight?
Okay, thank you, Indigo. So yes, I guess as a student in the end of the 70s, I kind of dropped out of university and dropped into the peace movement. It was the time of Greenham Common Women's Peace Camp. There was lots of things going on around nuclear weapons, both with big marches with CND and activity at the bases. And I felt very at home there. I moved to Scotland to the peace camp at Faslane, which is outside the submarine base where the UK's nuclear weapons are based, and lived there for 6 years. And then I've been involved ever since in one organisation or another, both with Trident Ploughshares, with Faslane 365, a year of blockades at Faslane, with Newport, who tracks the nuclear weapons convoys, and involved both in action myself, but also lots of support for those actions, because you need a whole support team around them. So kind of come a bit from all angles and all different kinds of things. Okay.
Thank you. I can't wait to hear more. Peter, would you introduce yourself, please?
Well, I began my political campaigning and human rights work way back in 1967 at the age of 15 when I was still at school. I was inspired by the Black Civil Rights Movement in America, and my first ever campaign was against the death penalty in 1967 in my hometown of Melbourne, Australia. Then after that, I got involved in campaigns for Aboriginal land rights and against Australia and America's involvement in the war in Vietnam. Over the last 53 years, I've calculated I've probably been involved in more than 3,000 direct action and civil disobedience protests. I've been arrested well over 100 times, but I'm very proud to say that I've only got one standing conviction, and that is for going into the pulpit of the then Archbishop of Canterbury, Dr. George Carey, on Easter Sunday in 1998, when myself and members of Outrage protested against his endorsement of legal discrimination against the LGBT plus community. And that conviction is quite a unique one. It's not a commonplace one. I was charged, prosecuted, and convicted for, quote, indecent behavior in a church. I hasten to add, I did not drop my trousers, under the Ecclesiastical Courts Jurisdiction Act of 1860, formerly part of the Brawling Act of 1551. And under that law, any interruption of a minister of religion during a church service is deemed to be indecent. I could have been fined £5,000 and sent to prison for 6 months, but the magistrate accepted that the protest was peaceful, it was brief, and I'm not insulted the Archbishop of the Christian faith, and he fined me instead £18.60, which was paid for me by Feminists Against Censorship. So that's a little snapshot of my activism.
Fantastic. That's an unbelievable record of convictions, considering the amount of actions you've taken part in. Ramon, would you introduce yourself to the listeners at home?
Thanks, Cindy. Wow, I mean, just sharing with Jane and Peter in here, right? I mean, just so humbled. I don't know how to even start. So great to have you. Thank you, Indigo, and everybody in the production team, because you are guys being cameras and editors and all of that from the kind of like living room, which is pretty outstanding that we can do this. My story of activism really starts being active when I think joining Extinction Rebellion, because everything else was pretty much kind of feeling like I was fitting. And obviously I was involved in queer rights since I was a very young boy, but and possibly inspired by the many actions that Peter Tatchell and at the time the Gay Liberation Front and how it became ACT UP and then the for outrage when they came to this country. Started with Extinction Rebellion with Fashion Action, and at the moment I'm on high risk support, which action is going to be arrestable, or or people are going to do the sacrifice or go into prison, and with Money Rebellion, and we now planning the rent strike. Thanks, Cindy.
Yeah, that's fantastic. So Jane, feels like we've got a lot to learn off all of you from 1 year of Extinction Rebellion. Would you tell me a bit about some of the campaigns you've been involved in?
Okay, where to start? Well, as you've said, I've had spent most of my adult life campaigning against nuclear weapons. And I've done lots of the traditional things like marches and street stalls and lobbying and petitions and all that sort of thing. But because I believe non-violent direct action is really vital in applying pressure, in keeping it in the public eye, that's kind of where I've focused my energies. That's been lots of different kinds of actions, from sort of like small affinity group actions to mass actions where we've invited lots of people to come on board, sometimes just one person taking action and all the support around that. Sometimes speaking up, sometimes just getting in the way of things. And for me, I think what's important is that however it fits into the strategy, however it fits into the rota of who's doing what this week, it's important as every individual that you kind of do it from your own spirit. You feel it's the right thing to do. So for me, that took me to live at Faslane Peace Camp in the 1980s. There were over 30 peace camps across the country outside different bases, and it appealed to me because it was non-hierarchical, and also it was like living a lifestyle. You kind of lived your protest. It wasn't just a thing you did on a Thursday night or a particular fortnight or something. It was like just being there was the protest, because all the people that come to work at the nuclear submarine base drive past in the morning. They see the banners, they see that we're there, we wave at them. We'd be, it would be this constant reminder that the job they do isn't just any old job, it's a very contentious job. So that in itself to me was always an action. But the peace campers are always very creative and passionate about the things that it did. And I think that creativity is kind of followed through, and I see Extinction Rebellion being very creative, but there's certainly plenty of history of that in the UK, of people doing things. But underneath the creativity, there's like the really serious issues. So nuclear weapons, I think in the 80s, we felt that we were about to have a nuclear war any minute. A lot of us had nightmares. We had the imagination of the whole world just crumpling into this huge blast and heat, and everybody that we loved dying. And it feels often with the climate, it's similar. It's kind of what we saw happening in 12 minutes is now kind of coming at us in 12 years, but that's still a blink of an eye. So it's that same dealing with the awfulness of it by taking action, but by being creative and positive with it is important. So the kind of things that I've done is that for instance, the nuclear weapons that arrive at Faslane to go out on the submarines are made in AWE Burford, which is near Reading. So that's just historical that the warheads are made near Reading, and they have to be transported all the way up the country in these big convoys of about 27 trucks. So there are big, huge articulated lorries that have the warheads in them, but all the security that goes with them, and a breakdown truck and a fire engine and a coach and all this stuff. So they've been coming up and down the country all the time. I feel like they've come trundling through my life time after time. And I've been involved in a sort of network of basically a very small number of very obsessed people who kind of track them up and down the country, but also times where we've gone and stood in front of them. I was just looking today, I've been arrested 6 times for standing in front of these things. So we have a very good set of guidelines. You don't just leap in front of a great big truck carrying nuclear bombs, because that could kind of, make us lose half of west of Scotland or something. So we do it in daylight on good roads, no ice, at a place where it's going slowly. Most of the time these convoys travel along motorways pretty fast, but when they, particularly at two ends of the journey or where it stops for a break, it has to go into smaller roads. So it used to come past the end of my street when I lived in Helensburgh, and there've been times when we've gathered together with banners, and as we've seen those trucks coming down the hill, and you can hear on the police radios, you can hear kind of where it's at, you know, it's on its way, and then it just appears down the road, the support vehicles, and there's a moment that's just you just know there's a perfect moment where you can just step into the road and you have eye contact with the driver, and you can see him, he can see you, and they're expecting us anyway, so you can stand and put your hands up. And in terms of nuclear weapons, it's quite difficult to get in the way of them. A lot of the time they're behind very secure fences, they're out at sea on submarines, but this is the point when they're being delivered. They're coming down the road, and I just feel for those few minutes, few seconds even sometimes, before you kind of be tackled off the road, you can stand in front of it and say, no, you go no further till you move me out of your way. You won't do this. So that's very direct, non-violent, direct action. I've got, there's lots more examples of different kinds of things. I don't know if you wanted to.
That sounds, wow, like the bravery that's involved in stepping out in front of a lorry. In Extinction Rebellion, we sometimes do swarming roads, but it's with lots of people joining into the road. You mentioned like our strategy is involved with getting at least 3.5% of the population out onto the streets to take part in that non-violent direct action. So I'm wondering if there are some action that you've been involved in which is about that mass participation of people.
Yeah, well, with Trident ploughshares, so ploughshares, everybody doesn't always know these days, but a ploughshare is the thing that you drag along behind the horse or the tractor, and it turns the field, it ploughs the field. And it comes from the bit in Isaiah where we turn swords into ploughshares. So it's about transforming the negative thing into something useful and positive. And Trident Ploughshares isn't a religious group, but those of us that maybe are not Christian do quite still like that imagery of the swords going into ploughshares. So we had a number of amazing actions, people doing things, throwing £80,000 worth of computers in their lock and all sorts of stuff like that. We also needed to have action where lots of people could join in. It would be kind of low risk, low consequence, relatively. And so we organised some big blockades at Fastlane, where we'd spend about 6 months mobilising, going out, doing lots of training, getting people along, and on a particular day having maybe 1,000 people turn up out kind of the back of Helensburgh, which is 30 miles from Glasgow, for 7 o'clock in the morning to stop the shift change going in, and people sitting down. And there was, I think the biggest one, I think there was something like 380 arrests, and they only stopped arresting because it got to kind of 5 o'clock and our buses had to leave with everybody that was left, and it was like they'd still not managed to clear the road. So they constantly were arresting people, and more people were going into the road and blocking it and locking themselves together in loads of very creative ways. So that was kind of a mass mobilization for one day. Fastlane 365, we had over 1,000 arrests over the space of a year. So that's where we had a rota. We had different groups turning up to do a 2-day slot and do some sort of disruption. And the groups were autonomous. That was really exciting because for us, we didn't always know what was going to happen. We'd, as the organisers, would turn up there and be equally surprised by the different creative ways that people had of blocking the road. Spanish group turned up and poured red paint all over themselves, and the police kind of stood back, and it took them a while to figure out getting some overalls so that they would come and arrest people without getting covered in paint. People made lock-ons of all sorts of things, and because the police were turning up every day and were trying to spot the lock-ons, so we had to keep going one step ahead, getting more creative in the ways that we could block that road and get across the road, you know, calls to let's have a tea break. Let's all go across to the tea urn. But halfway there, of course, you'd stop and drop to the ground and lock onto some innocent looking prop you had with you. So there was always something like that. And that was mobilizing lots of people to come over a period of time. And importantly, going outside our usual bubble of the peace movement, trying to bring in people from all over the country and people that, yeah, a bit like the communities in XR, bringing in the musicians and teachers and lots of different people.
Yeah, I think that's the way we're going to have to go. We've managed a sort of 2 weeks rebellion, but we want to do much longer ones, and like organizing groups across different movements to come at different times is one way we'll do that. You mentioned very briefly dropping a lot of expensive computer equipment into the loch. I'm wondering if you can explain that more, sort of what we might call a high risk action, in a bit more detail to people listening, and how it was received in the court of law.
Right, so that was in 1999. 3 women from Trident Ploughshares went out on a lovely June evening into Loch Goyle, which is near to Fast Lane. And in this loch there's a barge, and it's a research barge, and it tests so before a submarine goes out to sea, because it's got to be super secret and quiet so that the Russians don't know where it is. So they take it and they submerge it in this deep sea loch, and they can then listen to it to make sure there's no kind of clanky noises anywhere or anything that's kind of leaking sound before it goes on its patrol. So it's kind of a vital bit of the whole Trident system. So these 3 women went out there in the evening, and it was closed up, you know, and they got on board it, and they broke into it, and they damaged a number of things. But they decided the easiest, quickest way to actually get rid of all the computer equipment, which was sitting on benches all the way around it, was to pass them out through the window and throw them in the water, which they did. It was about £80,000 worth of computer equipment that got thrown overboard. So eventually they had to wait a while, but eventually the police turned up. In fact, the police turned up because we'd actually issued the press release, because we were on the deadline for it. And the press phoned up the police and said, what about these women out in Loch Goyle? And they were, oh, what women? So the police went out to have a look, and it all looked quite tidy when they went in. They thought, well, you've not done much, it's nice and tidy. But only then did they realise it wasn't supposed to be that tidy, and all the stuff was, you know, in the water. So they arrested, they were held on remand, they went to court, and we had a wonderful 3-week court case. There was video from a camera on a mini sub that went down to film all this stuff, and we all sat in the court as we watched like keyboards with starfish wandering across it, and like a crab on top of a monitor kind of waving its claws at us, and it was just seeing all the stuff being turned into playthings for the creatures in the sea. But they argued that nuclear weapons are illegal. They had tons of evidence. Angie Zelter did her own defense brilliantly. The other 2, Ulla and Ellen, had great lawyers. I mean, we all worked as a team, and they argued nuclear weapons are illegal, that our government hadn't done what it had promised to disarm them, and they'd had to take it into their own hands. They'd tried everything else. They'd stood for Parliament. They'd done all the things you do, and that this was the only thing they could do, is to take this action. And the sheriff, who right from the beginning, that's what you call a judge in Scotland, the sheriff listened to all this, and she said, well, yeah, I think you're right, and I find you not guilty. So it was like a big, huge kerfuffle then in Scotland amongst the courts, and they were released. So great celebration. The courts then did go on at a higher court to try, and they couldn't overturn that because it was technically the jury that had agreed that. Every day when the jury went out, the judge said, the sheriff said, you know, you can't talk to each other about this, you know, and you can't talk to anyone else about this. But actually one of them did come to us and said, actually after the very first session, they'd all gone back to the jury room and decided they were all going to find them not guilty, whatever happens. So it was good to know they had our back. But having it as a legal finding was like really amazing. Yeah, so that was one of the big ones. And we had a whole support team around all that. We ran an office and did lots of press work, and didn't have all this wonderful technology to do it with, because I just think, gosh, how much we could have
And
got to work that more.
All the people who go to support action. We have from legal teams to chefs to samba drummers to people who are organizing the social media. There's so much that's going on into the backgrounds of the sort of arrestable roles. And yeah, it's just phenomenal that those actions went on to be proven correct, proven not guilty in court. And that's really how we can start to see that shift for change. For people listening who haven't heard about this, there's a book called Hammer Blow, which some of Jane's friends would have been involved in, which is the story of an action where they disarmed a Hawk warplane bound for Indonesia, and were proved not guilty of £2.4 million worth of damage. So it's really, really phenomenal, this how we sort of see these things shifting within the courts. We've got so many great people to hear from, so we're going to move on now to Peter. Would you tell us a bit about how it was in the early days of Outrage and how that felt to be starting up something that at the time was so outrageous, but to me, being born in the 90s, now feels like commonplace?
Well, first, let me pick up on the question you asked Jane about organising big mass protests. From when I was 16, I was involved in the anti-Vietnam War movement in my hometown of Melbourne, Australia. And I was on the executive of the Vietnam Moratorium campaign. And we thought about the idea of calling for a general strike against the war. But we knew the connotations of that would not be palatable to many members of the public. So we chose the slogan, "Stop work to stop the war." That was more appealing to the general population, who had a very different view about general strikes. So in 1970, we organised this first ever "Stop Work to Stop the War" protest in Melbourne, Australia. And on that day, 100,000 people blockaded the streets of central Melbourne at a time when the total population was only 1 million. So that was 10% of the entire adult and child population of the city of Melbourne. And that really was the turning point in terms of the Australian government beginning its process of pulling out of Vietnam. Going back to your question about outrage, I mean, yeah, it's hard to forget, or for some people hard to remember, that until 1999, Britain had by volume the largest number of anti-gay laws of any country in the world, some of them dating back centuries. And all attempts at negotiation had got nowhere. So Outrage was formed in 1990 to try and do something about that. And we very much modeled ourselves on the suffragettes and the Black Civil Rights Movement in America. We were committed to non-violent, direct action and civil disobedience to challenge those homophobic, biphobic and transphobic laws. And over the course of Outrage's history, which lasted astonishingly for 21 years, an all-volunteer, unpaid grassroots organisation, it was run by weekly meetings held in London where any LGBT+ person could attend, speak and vote. It was like a grassroots democracy from the floor to decide what our policy was. We lasted for 21 years. And although I get a lot of credit about this, I want to say that it wasn't just me. It was thousands and thousands and thousands of people who made Outrage what it was. And we did, you know, in the early days in particular, a direct action or civil disobedience protest every 2 or 3 weeks. That went on for years and years and years. And there were hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of us arrested. You know, when you think about it, it was only because we did this direct action and were very media savvy and aware that we got very significant media coverage about our protests. I mean, sometimes we are criticized as, you know, we just do stunts, but the protests we did were designed deliberately to be daring, imaginative, creative, often witty, to get media coverage in order to raise public awareness about the scale of anti-LGBT plus discrimination. And through raising that awareness, then provoking debate and discussion. And through those debates and discussions, then also helping to change hearts and minds, and in particular, to put the authorities under pressure to change. And we did our research, we did incredibly thorough research before any action to show why we did this, to give examples of the injustice that we were fighting. So for example, even in 1990, same-sex couples were being arrested in London for merely kissing and holding hands. That was regarded as outraging public decency, or alternatively, under the Public Order Act, causing harassment, alarm, or distress. So one example, we did a mass kiss-in in Piccadilly Circus, where we had 200 same-sex couples. We publicized the arrests and convictions of those lesbian and gay couples who were taken to court and convicted. And even members of the public who perhaps were not very sympathetic. Our pitch was, why are the police wasting their time on victimless behavior where no one is harmed when they claim they haven't got enough officers to deal with rape and sexual assaults, racist attacks, burglaries, and street crime? And even members of the public who were not particularly sympathetic got that message. They thought, even though they perhaps didn't approve of homosexuality, they didn't think that was a good use of police resources. So I've got to say that 1 hour before that kissing took place, we won, because in the weeks beforehand, we had so much negative publicity about the police. The police were really embarrassed, and so much so that they felt they had to change their policy. So 1 hour before the protest, they announced that from that moment onwards, no same-sex couples would be arrested in future. So we won before we even began. That's very typical of what Outrage did. And we did it with great style and panache. I remember after that kiss-in, we had a telephone call at the Outrage office. We had an office for a brief period, from a Japanese tour company. And they said, we were passing through Piccadilly Circus last week and we saw your kiss-in. It was so wonderful. All our people in our tour party, they loved it. When are you doing the next one? So you can see, if you can break down people's hostility, if you can find a way to get them to laugh or entertain them, that's often a good way to diffuse homophobia or other prejudices. And we did that very effectively over many, many, many years.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I think that that shock often speaks to people. Like when Extinction Rebellion was first given that name, people said, oh, it's going to be too much to the public. But actually, we found that really direct messaging is actually what really gets through to people, and sort of playing on those things that society thinks to be taboo is actually a big way to hook the media and get our message across. Yes, I'm wondering if you can tell us about another action where you had mass participation.
Well, a lot of the stuff that Outrage did not involve mass participation because it required utmost secrecy. So yeah, we did have other protests. Like we had in 1992, we had the Equality Now civil disobedience campaign, which lasted non-stop for 6 months, where week after week we challenged and protested against all the particular anti-LGBT laws that existed, like the ban on same-sex marriage, Section 28, the fact that same-sex couples couldn't foster or adopt children, the fact that if two men chatted each other up in the street with consent and agreement, they could be put in prison for up to 2 years. We did this just non-stop for 6 months. And that did involve, some of the protests involved 3,000 or 4,000 people. Others were quite small because not everyone is prepared to get arrested. So for example, when we did the notorious citizens' arrest of President Mugabe of Zimbabwe on charges of human rights abuses, notably torture, it was done by only 4 of us. We probably could have got more, but it was very short notice. We only had a tip off on a phone call on a Thursday night, and it had to be done on a Saturday morning. So just 4 members of Outrage went to do that, and we took a camera person, an independent journalist, and a video person, so that everything would be independently corroborated what we did. So that was an example of a small group where, like Jane said, we ran in front of Mugabe's speeding limousine, forced it to a halt. It literally screeched to a halt about 6 inches in front of our legs. Then one of us ran behind the car, so it couldn't go forward and couldn't go backward. I ran to the side door, and amazingly, the rear left-hand door was open, unlocked. I reached in and put Mugabe under arrest. You should have seen the look on his face. He is very dark-skinned, but a visible ashen color came across his face. He recorded in his chair and his back seat with his hands up. You could see he was absolutely terrified. And of course, I held out my hands to show I didn't have a weapon. But I thought, when he reacted in that way, I thought, now you know what your victims feel like, and we aren't going to torture you or murder you. We're going to get you arrested, take you to court of law. You'll have a chance to defend yourself. Due process. In the end, of course, when we summoned the police arrested us, and they gave President Mugabe a police escort to go Christmas shopping at Harrods. We did not succeed, but that attempt made headlines around the world, and most importantly, it helped get a lot of media coverage about human rights abuses in Zimbabwe that were not widely known back in 1999. And of course, we did this on the initiative and the request of human rights activists in Zimbabwe. They asked us to do something to help expose Mugabe's human rights regime, human rights abusing regime, and that's what we chose to do.
Wow. So the actions of outrage, we can see that they probably made like the fastest law reform process in history. And I think when we're looking at our aims as Extinction Rebellion, we need to create a huge law reform process ourselves. Do you think that both Jane and yourself has mentioned this process of action, changing public opinion, and then that going to the court of law and the law shifting, and then we can hope for some kind of policy or law change? Do you think that we can use this model to create the change that we would like to see?
Well, you're right. I mean, the thinking behind the outrage actions was, of course, twofold: to change the law or change the way institutions operate, but also to change public opinion. And we did that in advance of changing the law. But because we changed public opinion, members of parliament felt more confident about legislating equality and ending discrimination. So you're absolutely right. And I think already Extinction Rebellion, and I've been part of those protests, we've already achieved a huge change in public opinion and political opinion. So I think the time is now right for specific concrete changes in law and the way in which government and business and others operate.
Yeah, I'm just thinking again about how, especially in this COVID times, we're all quite fearful, and I'm wondering what the kind of atmosphere was like when you were taking action in the, say, early 90s. Did you feel scared or did you feel courageous?
A bit of both, I reckon. Yeah, I said I took inspiration from the Black Civil Rights Movement in America and the suffragettes. I understood. I read my history. I knew what they went through. I knew that there were lots of things they did were dangerous and had quite damaging and devastating personal consequences for some of them. But I thought, unless you kick up a fuss, nothing will ever change. But I've got to say that, having said that, I mean, I've never sued the Metropolitan Police or any other police forces, but I probably should have. I mean, I've been very brutally treated over the years in some of those arrests, even just simple things like putting on the rigid handcuffs that are like mini stocks. They put them around your wrist, they close them really tight, so they cut into your nerves and cause excruciating pain. And then they twist them to make it even worse. I've been under that kind of thing in one instance, that was done to me for about 25 minutes. And I'm pretty strong and resilient, but I was screaming and in tears. But then again, I haven't been murdered like many human rights defenders around the world. I haven't been imprisoned or tortured like many have. So I count myself lucky. I've got away with it.
You've called yourself a Duracell activist, saying you would retire when you're 95. And what are your tips, do you think, for keeping going, because in the face of all this?
Well, very simple, practical things. You have to look after yourself. You have to eat well, exercise, be emotionally, on top of yourself, and have close, supportive friends you can rely on. They're just very basic things, but also, I suppose what's fueled me over these 50 plus years has been the successes, not just my successes or the successes that I've been involved in, but all the other successes that other people have done. You know, the Green and Common women, they were a great inspiration too. You know, the struggle against apartheid in South Africa, that was a great inspiration. So just learning and knowing from history that change is possible, that people who rise up with the strength and resolve to make change happen, sometimes they don't succeed, but a lot of the time they do. So together, we can make the change. And that's incredibly energizing. It gives me hope every day to carry on.
Yeah, they're great tips for carrying on. And me and Jane have been talking about how the garden is a lifesaver at this time to keep us in check. Ramon, I'm wondering if you'd like to spend some time recounting XR action from a year ago, just before the April Rebellion, when we felt very much on the fringes of things happening.
Thanks, Cindy. I had something prepared, but just listening right now to Jane and Peter, the whole thing changes in my mind very quickly, because although that was an incredible action, it was transgenerational, was the people from XR youth. Russia was one of the busiest streets in the UK and possibly in Europe, Oxford Circus, etc., stopping the traffic, great energy, etc., etc. But all this situation that we created, that it had a representation there and energized everyone. That was the participants and the people who were the passers-by, the shoppers. But it has also kind of like continuity, although the actions, I mean, both Peter and Jane was talking about how the legal consequences of an action, how it kind of goes into a line to the point in which the courtroom becomes also on a stage, a continuity of the action that you planned from the beginning. So it's got a rhythm, it's got different acts. I think one thing that strikes me, listening to Jane and Peter, and I would love to know more about it, because so many questions and so much inspiration I've taken through my life from you guys. So, which is basically, was stunt and sacrifice. To what point sacrifice is essential in order to create the narrative, for the people to identify, saying, well, if these guys are prepared to do this, how important it is. Is sacrifice an essential part of a civil disobedience in terms of how the message or the action is going to be communicated? And to what point, how does the sacrifice fits into the non-violent context? Was the sacrifice that we take in a way can be interpreted as a form of violence, and to what point is necessary? But more importantly, at a time of such the turmoil that we're experiencing right now, how do we do that sacrifice? How does activism takes into the future? How the history that you experience, we can pass it into a new way of activism, because things, they're never going to be the same. Yes, there's lots of questions that I have for you guys, and I'd rather listen to you than me explain the situations. But I have to say, Extinction Rebellion has so much honor, and honoring all the movements that have been before. For example, for the Black Panthers, the civil rights movements, Gandhi, the Plowshares, ACT UP, Outrage, we're taking from everything, even from rave culture. And this is because, no, we're taking, it's because we are. I mean, the people from Extinction Rebellion, the people from Plowshares is there. So basically, what we're doing is accumulating the entire history into activism to try to do something about it. Because if we don't stand up for it with this climate justice and the relation in between the climate ecological emergency and equality and injustice, human and animal rights, how do we put them together?
Okay, I don't know if you, Jane, or Peter have a reaction to Ramon there. Jane?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's important that we look after ourselves when we're taking action, but we do have to take some risks, and we do have to have some discomfort. I've never been particularly hurt by the police. I've probably been more hurt by being really wet and really cold and really tired, you know, when I've been doing things. but like when guys go out in a submarine for 2 months on patrol, they come back and they're in pain because they can't really exercise their bodies properly. They go out jogging. I've seen them jogging up the road with big backpacks, and it hurts to get their bodies going again. They can't drive their cars for the first few days because they can't see that far because they haven't looked further than the next bulkhead for all that time. So it's like if people will put themselves through that to do the wrong things, then we have to put ourselves through something to try and change that as well. So I think we do have to be prepared for some sacrifices, and certainly when we think of the climate, crisis, there are people all around the world suffering in huge ways already because of it, and it's coming to us. So I think, I think martyrdom isn't a word I'm not too sure about, but I think we do have to be prepared to be, outside our comfort zone, shall I say, to do things.
Thank you, Jane. Peter, you'd have to unmute.
Yeah, I think Jane is right that through our sacrifice and taking risks, we show and prove the sincerity and depth of our conviction. And that has great moral power, particularly when we are small people against big, powerful individuals or institutions. When you put yourselves in a risky situation for the sake of your beliefs, even people who may not entirely agree with you will, in many cases, have some respect because they know that you are taking a risk, that you're making a sacrifice. And it's not that we want to make a sacrifice. I always say I'd rather sit down over a cup of tea and biscuits and sort things out with whoever. But if that's not possible, then yes, we do have to make risk. And I think one of the reasons, for example, why the Black Civil Rights Movement in America was so powerful, was so morally and ethically powerful, was because, Black people put themselves in the firing line of water cannon and police dogs that was filmed and shown on TV. And even many people who perhaps were not, born anti-racists thought, wow, this is just such excessive force. These people are taking such blows, but they're still going at it. That's how the moral power shifted. It's sort of like a form of what I call political jujitsu, where you throw your opponent off balance by doing unpredictable things or doing things that are unexpected. So normally we don't expect that people will, put themselves at great risk or suffer pain or, the cold and shivering in winter when you're out there doing a direct action in wild weathers. But when people see that, they become more attuned to the sincerity of the person doing it.
That's a really interesting look at how we embed that sort of sacrifice and also the non-violence in the action we take. There's a question coming in from the audience, which is for Peter. It's saying, the question refers to something you said at the beginning about organising a mass general strike and changing people's views of strikes as political actions. Labour and rent strikes are bubbling away in Europe and the US as we speak. How do you perceive the British public's views on strikes currently?
But of course, as we know, because of sustained attacks by successive Tory governments, strikes are a bit of a no-no for a lot of people. And people take a very dim view, not recognising that it's often been through strike action that many of the rights that employees now enjoy were originally won. As I explained, we decided not to call that protest against the Vietnam War a general strike because we thought, particularly people who weren't in trade unions, that they'd be turned off by the term general strike. So we just rephrased it, the same intent, the same purpose, but we called it Stop Work to Stop the War. And that, I think, made it more accessible, more appealing, and less resistance towards it from the general public.
Thank you. Ramon, would you like to also talk to that, being involved in the Money Strike group?
Yeah, thanks, Indigo. It's a very interesting debate about how does strike, what it actually means, and how does it mean for people. Obviously, the tradition of striking in Europe, in the main continent of Europe, has a totally different history that is here. I think it's more recognized in places such as Spain and France and Italy, where a strike means as a tool of change. But I'm interested in the act of striking at this very moment, as when they kind of like mask the reality has transformed, and what it was remote has become immediacy for many. The possibility and the fact of poverty and homelessness and etc. is a reality for thousands and thousands and thousands of people. And then at that very moment, climate ecological emergency becomes climate justice, becomes social justice. So there is what it used to be almost like an accordion kind of shape of proximity, now so immediate in this country than ever. And it's also a great opportunity at a time when the people actually are looking at different ways to organize themselves, ourselves, and how we can actually make a force enough to actually change the future. I mean, this to me, this sounds very simple because it gives elements of agency and the finality of what we're doing. And the strike means this is we occupying the transactional space. But instead of constructing a situation, which we're occupying, for example, as we did with Fashion Action and the Oxford Circus, the physical space where the transaction is made, what we're doing is actually occupying a space which actually is where still working at all the levels of lockdown. And it has a power not just to feel like you're part of something, which is very important. It's a place in the negotiation table, an opportunity to put this idea, this beautiful idea of the citizens' assemblies into place. And it's a time when actually climate justice and social justice, they no longer have to be actually working from the outside. It's a space where we have power to actually change how we've been, what our space and that transactional environment that we're taking. So money is actually the way the activism, I guess, is going to take over until it becomes obsolete, hopefully soon.
Thank you, Ramon. There's a question here for Jane. It says, you talked about the group Trident Ploughshares, which you helped to start. Can you give us an indication of what the public's reaction was like to it in the beginning?
Okay, so yeah, I didn't quite start it. I was in near the beginning. So the original idea was saying that we get 100 people to pledge to go and do whatever we can to break the machinery of the nuclear weapons system. We produced a handbook. It showed you how to break into bases, how to get to the submarine, what bits were safe to kind of hammer on, what bits you really shouldn't go near. And so there was a bit of shock from some people. Some of the bits of the peace movement were a bit wary of backing it because they thought all their funds were going to get seized and they'd all be up in court for conspiracy. So there had to be a bit of nerve from the first people that kind of put their names out there. From the general public, I don't know, I think the biggest reaction actually that we actually saw from the general public, and it was really interesting to me, was during Fastlane 365, when we were blocking Fastlane regularly, like at least every second day, there would be traffic holdups because we were stopping workers getting into the base. And so it meant local people got caught up in that. Now, the police could have arranged it differently so that they kept the base workers in one line and they let local people through, but they didn't choose to do that. They were quite happy for local people to be getting held up and cross with us. And they started their own campaign. They kind of mirrored ours, and they started having protests across the road from us. But their big point was that they wanted the things to all go back to normal. And I remember making a big banner, and it just said, having nuclear weapons in your backyard isn't normal. This isn't normal. And so I heard that as well during Extinction Rebellion a lot. It was like, I want to be able to get my bus. I want to be able to do things. You know, you're all kind of inconvenient. I want things back to normal. And I think that's the important bit, is trying to get people to understand that normal is about to change very much. And clearly we've got used to a lot of very strange, unnormal things, and very quickly actually, that we've adapted around them. We're doing this meeting like this. So I think, yeah, I think sometimes some people have to stick their necks out with the public, and then you have to bring them along with you. You have to draw them in and say, this is actually okay.
Yeah, sorry. Thank you, Jane. There's another question about creativity, saying that we can imagine that we've got a message to deliver when we are putting on an action, and there's lots of different characters, and there's the public who are our audience, and it's asking, what part do we think creativity has to play when planning actions? That can be open to anyone. Peter, you're on mute.
So perhaps Ramon could have a view, because he hasn't spoken very much.
Thanks, Peter. The kind of reason I haven't spoken much is because I really want to hear what Jane and yourself have to say, because you are kind of someone like guys that plan actions like the ones you have, some of them that an individual doing a civil arrest, as you did with Mugabe, or the ones that Jane was involved with.
Ramon, we want to hear you talk on creativity, because the fashion action was a whole amazing way of involving people in the conversation who were not part of the conversation before. The fashion action was this, like, the edge of doing something new, and I think the way we need to go, involving everyone in this conversation.
Oh, brilliant. Well, I took the opportunity then. Literally, the idea was just to break the membrane of the consumerism and production, and kind of like breaking up that membrane. We have to choose a pinpoint. So it was designed. It was designed to be disruptive. Humor was in the design, and it was referencing everything that happened before. So it was very site specific. Oxford Circus is a cross in the middle of London, which is pretty much the hourglass symbol of Extinction Rebellion. I mean, Jane was mentioning obviously the plowshares, which is a beautiful kind of element. It's got a symbolism in it, and obviously outrage, and then the triangle of ACT UP and symbology have to be there, because as the history of culture and humanity knows, we want to both keep our individuality and be part of our collective. And the differences in between the collective and individual is about identity, which is what fashion in particular at that point was going to sell. Is basically was selling an identity obsolete, one that is valueless, it has no spirit. So we were having to have Extinction Rebellion occupying Oxford Circus and many other sites during April, and amazingly converging. So these people coming from all over the country, from all over the world, into a place. And Extinction Rebellion, so many different talented from different groups. We were very knowledgeable of the power of the image, and obviously took everything that we knew from the past, from ACT UP, from civil rights movement, with rave scene, with the underground scene in New York and London, the club kids. All these factors were converging for people who actually reinterpreted. Exile Youth was essential component of it, because they took everything in a fresh way, with ingenuity. And basically the idea was change the way that the general public perceives the activist. And without going into cliches, what we did is to show the activist on all the explosive expression of human creativity. So it was an act of love and rebellion, and that's the important part of it, was transcending in terms of color, transcending into recovery electric pink, that's Schiaparelli pink, that is almost iconic now, Extinction Rebellion. The idea that you are unique, you are yourself, you don't need no one to tell you, and we all are together. We have something in common, something that transcends everything else that we have in difference, which sounds pretty hippie to me, which is another movement that we took so much from, but we give it that kind of punk edge, which is like, yeah, okay, this is fine, but we're gonna have to scream and possibly put a lot of sacrifice in it. So all these actions in Extinction Rebellion, that from them on, they have this characteristic, which is very well designed, but it's got an element of spontaneity. And they change in action planning. The action is planned until the moment, not just how it's going to be perceived by the public, but what effect has in the individual, what kind of elements of growth and becoming more aware of what you are. I call it peeling off layers. And just seeing Jane and Peter here, peeling off layers of, by having to have sacrifice, eventually you end up being raw, and that's where the growth happens. Sorry, Indy, I've been known for a while.
No, that's great. It's just there's one more question before we close the talk, and I want to ask it to each of you. So I just wanted to ensure this time. It says there's lots of comments. No, so the post is there's lots of comments on the live streams appreciating seeing intergenerational rebels storytelling together. We have so much to learn from each other. I wonder if you had any more seasoned activists from whom you took inspiration and support over the years. So it's about who's inspired us to do what we do. I'll ask who would like to go first, because I know that takes some thinking.
I can go if you want.
Yes, please.
Can you hear me?
We can hear you, yes.
Okay.
Yeah,
I'd say that I've got lots of inspirations, but the ones I'd single out probably are Mohandas Gandhi, who was a key figure in the Indian independence movement and could happily and justly boast that he had secured the defeat, the effective political defeat of the greatest military superpower in history, what was then the British Empire, without hurting the hair on the head of a single British soldier. And that's an extraordinary achievement done entirely non-violently against what was then the greatest military power in history. Also, Sylvia Pankhurst, more so Sylvia than Emmeline, because Sylvia was not only committed to vote to women, but for the general upliftment of women, in particular working class women. So she did a lot around issues about low pay for women workers, around child nursery provision, around cheap restaurants so that women wouldn't have to go home from work and cook again. And then also Martin Luther King, who led the Black Civil Rights Movement in America. Again, echoing Gandhi, doing so non-violently and taking on an American political establishment that would not negotiate, would not listen. There were other groups like the Congress for Racial Equality, but they got virtually nowhere. It was only when Martin Luther King, and to some extent the Black Power movement and the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee began to doing direct action, that things really began to change. So those three people have inspired me. Now, I walk in their shadows. I'm a minnow by comparison, but I'm really feel greatly indebted to the ideas, the values, the methods that they taught me to use.
Thank you, Peter. Jane or Ramon, can you briefly explain someone who's inspired you? Jane?
Yes, I mean, Peter's already mentioned some of the ones that also inspire me, but the reading about some of the early plowshares action in the United States, groups of people that went in and during the Vietnam War took the draft, went into the draft offices and took all the draft cards out and set fire to them to stop people getting called up. But also people that broke into nuclear bases and actually hammered on some of the machinery of the nuclear weaponry with hammers, literally dented it. Obviously not the bits that could blow up, but the the bits that would be going to use for that. So, and we're getting incredibly long sentences. We're getting like up to 18 years in prison and things like that. And still in the States, people that do things like just cross a line get like 6 months in prison, whereas here we get a bit of a fine or a rap on the knuckles. So people who really kind of put their bodies where their principles were to do that. So yeah, I just think we have so many examples. And in this country, in Glasgow, in the rent strikes during the First World War, when the women were reacting to the rents being constantly increased and were going out and refusing to pay them, and were supporting each other to prevent evictions during the poll tax, during all these things. I think we sometimes get a bit hooked up on one or two particular, amazing heroes, but there are loads and loads of examples of people that have done things, and we don't get taught that in the schools, so we need to educate ourselves and all share that history.
I really agree that there's so many people and all these different laws that we're up against. Ramon, do you want to share someone who has inspired you?
That's Indigo. I think the same with Jane and Peter. I mean, I get inspiration from so many people during history, and it's weird enough because in the first day of lockdown, I decided to every day look for birthdays in one of those websites that says who was birthday today, and find people that they were activists some way or other, and read the biography that day, because I needed this kind of people to look up to in times when I felt that was a bit shaky. I mean, Peter Tatchell has been one of the people I look up to, always thinking, wow, that's courage. And obviously Larry Kramer. But in general, to me, it's always been every single queer person that decides to risk it, go out there and rebel every single day, from the way that we walk to the supermarket and for the way that we do our clubbing. So it is already a rebellion, waking up in the morning and having to face a wall that is deeply homophobic, transphobic, and misogynist. So all those rebels inspire me. In Extinction Rebellion, the people who really do inspire me are the elders, something that is more relevant than ever because they are the depositories of emotional intelligence and verbal history. It's the people who are dying now in our care homes. So all these people in Extinction Rebellion in the 70s and 80s, that suddenly doing the Heathrow pause at 75 years old, risking to be arrested for flying a drone in an airport because they believe that their future generations were being a risk. All of these people do inspire me.
Thank you. I think that's a really good place to end the call. And I hope that these stories that you've told in this call will go on to inspire people at home. And I hope everyone has a wonderful evening and comes back next week to watch Actions Talk again. And also keep your eyes on the timetable, as Peter Tatchell will be joining us for another talk with Rupert Reed discussing COVID crisis, what comes next. So thank you all, everyone here and at home. Goodbye.
Bye.
Bye.